So can you hear me in the back now? How can you be waving your head no? I've always wondered how that worked. Now you can hear? Yes. Okay, good. Sometimes a small change is something you can make. The volume. Good. But in software, there's no such thing as a small change. And I do have people come up to me at conferences and say, oh, if Oracle just made this single small change, things would be so good. But when you think about the ramifications, the impact that could have on so many things, no such thing really as a small change. And so, for example, when I was making this presentation, I went around looking for some other articles to back this up. And I found this one. It was a website that basically somebody came in and said, you know what? This Twitter thing's becoming really popular. It's really cool to send these tweets out. And so what we'd like to do is take our review section and make this small change. All we want to do is limit the length of a review in our application to 140 characters, SMS-like. And then we could start, tweeting this stuff out. How cool would this be? You can imagine the business guy, coming into the developer and saying, you can make this change in like 30 seconds, right? You just sort of hack the form together, limit it to 140 characters, and it's done. We can do this immediately. Think about it. What might this impact in the application? First question you got to ask is, what happens when you exceed 140 characters? Don't forget, there's existing data out there that isn't 140 characters. What's going to happen in 2 months when you hire a new developer who understands this business rule, it's 140 characters, and then they start querying some legacy data where it's 2 megabytes of text, right? So there's some legacy data to think about. What happens to the existing interface? Do you just silently truncate at 140 characters? Or do you display an error message? When you're typing along and all of a sudden you hit 140, do you pop up a little dialog box and make them hit OK? Do you make it beep? Maybe you'd put a little beep sound on it. I hate when that happens. I don't know how many times I've gone to a website where they say, we value your input, and then they give you a box this big to type into. So I fire up Microsoft Word or something and I type in a paragraph, and then I go and cut and paste it in, and voila, my well thought out response of 5 pages is truncated to 200 characters, right? Or even worse, you paste it in and they beep once for every character that exceeds 200. And your machine's just going beep, 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 beep for the next 5 minutes. So there's a couple of interface things to think about. Even down to who's going to write the error message that goes along with that. And that's something to really think about. What does the error message look like and what is the style? I travel a lot and I use a website, united.com. They fly planes and stuff. And I went there a while ago and I put in something and I hit enter like I always did. And here's the error message they decided to give me. Unknown error. Please try again later. Okay? You got to think about these things. And furthermore, with this error message, I got this on my phone. How many people on the planet do you think know that this error happened? I bet you it was 1, and that's me. Do you think the system actually recorded an error message? Do you think anybody's going to look into this? And do you think if you called up United, the airline, and said, hey, I got an unknown error on your website, do you think the operator's actually going to know who to put you in touch with or anything like that? This would just be a really frustrating sort of thing. You do want some editing on the client because you don't want a round trip to the server to validate this. So you wouldn't want somebody to put in 5 pages worth of text, hit the enter key, the submit button, and then have an error message come back and say, sorry, you're limited to 140. Right? So you're going to want to do some editing on the client because it's a bad user experience, and also it's a non-scalable implementation. If you actually have the database do all of the validation and have the database be the only thing that does the validation, the database is doing a lot of work it shouldn't have to do. We want successful transactions to be applied against the database. We don't want a whole bunch of unsuccessful ones. So we do want the editing on the client, but we still need editing in the database. Why? Because you'll probably do the validation in JavaScript or something like that. It's really easy to go tools, options, content, enable JavaScript. No, right? So I can bypass your validation. On Ask Tom, I've noticed a lot of people have set up their own API to Ask Tom. They go query it and do things against it without using my user interface. The web works great that way, right? People can just run your URL. So bypassing your client validation is pretty easy. So we need to do it in the database, but we also need to do it in the client. And who's going to code that JavaScript? Who's going to code the JavaScript that works in Chrome, in Firefox, in IE version 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever they're on now? You know,
they're on 10, actually.
10, on Safari, on the Dolphin browser I use on my phone, on this browser, on that browser, on the other browser. Who's going to do all that validation? All of a sudden, this small, tiny change has turned into a rather large proposition. What about usability? It's sort of like a character counter, you know, sort of like they have on Twitter and other websites. Otherwise, I just don't look cool or something like that. Now we're starting to talk about a pretty complicated piece of code. So this is the point where a good developer would go out and start looking for code to reuse, right? And they'll start going to the Google, and they'll type in JavaScript character counter, and they'll find a JavaScript library, and that's great. It's got the one routine they want, and it's got 5,000 other routines in it. But they'll just save the zip or whatever file it is and say, include this JavaScript stuff. Who knows what else lurks in that file? Right? You've got to go through and vet that code. You've got to go through and make sure that code's actually safe. So it's still a pretty big job. You know, do the testing to ensure that it works on all the web servers. Make sure it's not infected in some way. And you still need to think about that user interface. Do you just stop accepting at 140 characters? Do you do it sort of like Twitter? Twitter lets you go over and then you have to backspace and sort of make it fit and stuff like that. What about cut and paste issues? And how do you display the existing data? Your user interface is all of a sudden expecting 140 characters. And it will get it from new data. But you have this legacy data issue. How do you explain to end users why their input is limited to 140 characters while the guy in front of them was able to write War and Peace? For those who don't know, War and Peace is a really thick book. Okay? Because you have legacy data out there. They're going to see reviews that far exceed what they're allowed to put in. You got that existing data. And there's an implied restriction that I didn't even think about as I was going through this. Before I get into this, I just want to point out that sometimes the text on the screen is black and sometimes the text is blue. And so I'll explain that nuance in just a second, but we're going to get into sort of a third thing here. This implied restriction wasn't specified. We want to limit the length of a review in our application to 140 characters, SMS-like. What is this implied restriction? One that I didn't think of when I was putting this together. This was pointed out to me later. That implied restriction is SMS has a very small character set. It's not a 7-bit character set. It's not an 8-bit character set. It's sort of a funky special character set. And you know, it's not a character set that you actually have in the database. We don't have the SMS character set. We've got Western European, we've got kanji, we've got UTF-8, we've got all kinds of stuff. We don't have an SMS character set. And if you go look at this character set, it's actually a pretty strange looking one. Some of the characters are single byte. Most of the characters are single byte. Some of the characters like euro signs and other things like that, squiggly brackets and such, actually constitute 2 bytes in that character set. Now you've got to validate that the input data you're receiving can actually be mapped into this character set, and if it isn't, come up with a way to map it into that character set. If your goal is to send it as an SMS, you got to fit into this. You know, that was the day I discovered my phone. I couldn't actually send a euro symbol because I don't have one on it. I'd have to know the escape code in order to do it. But it wasn't a problem I had ever recognized or realized. It was pointed out to me by someone else. If you want to do SMS, this is another implied constraint that you have to think about. So as I was reading through this article, which was done by a user interface, a UX designer, they came to it, they supplied all the text I had in black. They had all the user interface concerns. And at the end of their article, they were trying to point out, this is not a small change because of all these user interface things. As I was reading through the article, I was going, you forgot all about these database things. This is not a small change because of the existing legacy data, the data management problems, the new validation rule that we need inside the database. And then somebody pointed out the character set constraint, something I didn't even think about, right? And so all of a sudden we have another sort of issue. My point being is that the user interface designer by themselves was not qualified or capable to actually do the change analysis for this teeny tiny change. They needed to involve the database guys. They needed to involve somebody who knew SMS, which I didn't even think about initially. It took a whole bunch of people to come in and come up with all of the things you really need to think about for this tiny change. But people make these tiny changes all the time. Shortly after I gave this, the guy I referenced this morning, Bryn Llewellyn, the PL SQL person, he had to apply for an Indian visa, and he went to a screen that said, put in the object of the journey. In the one point, it's saying you have 3 characters left before the maximum limit is reached, but then he submitted the page and it comes back and says, please limit the number of characters to 80 or less. Your answer is currently 87 characters. So does he have 3 left to go? Is he 7 over? What happened here? This was a small change somebody probably put on this form, but it made it impossible for somebody to put in any sort of description that was at or about 80 characters. I don't even know how long this field should actually be at this point, right? So this happens a lot. Here's another example of a small change. You guys might not even be able to relate to this though, because this is the country of perpetual spring, as I understand it. Let's say we did a contract with you, and we're coming from the United States, and we want to have you manufacture green street lights for us, the stop lights, the red, green, yellow things. Because all of ours run on incandescent light bulbs. They suck electricity like it's going out of style. So you guys, you prototype and you build an awesome street light. It runs on LEDs, it's very energy efficient, and you field test it for a year, all 4 seasons, right? Then you give it to us. And we deploy it in Minnesota. In Minnesota, it gets cold. In fact, it gets so cold that when it snowed on these LED street lights, which didn't put out any heat, the snow just sat there and you couldn't see the lights anymore. It's a very small change. Nobody would disagree with this change. Use LEDs instead of incandescent light bulbs. This is going to be great. What they didn't realize when they made this change is, and I'm going to read a sentence from here. Where is it? It turns out, perhaps in an homage to bad engineering everywhere, that the inefficiency of incandescent light bulbs was previously relied upon to keep traffic signals unimpeded. Another way of reading that is, one person's bug is another person's feature. Small change, I fixed the bug. Do you know how many bug fixes in the Oracle database have broken something else? I relied on that bug. You guys went and fixed it, right? But it was obviously a bug. There is no such thing as a small change. This seems like a small, simple change. Make the streetlights more efficient. They had to go back and re-engineer them. They had to add heaters in some cases, so that if it dropped below a certain temperature, they became inefficient again. Or they just redesigned the whole thing and they put a slanted glass cover on the front of each light so that the snow could not accumulate, right? But they had to go back and re-engineer it. They didn't think of what happens when it snows, right? And if you guys had been building this, you wouldn't even know to think of that, right? Because you don't see snow that often. You see it in the movies, but not in real life. Not knowing how to ask for help. This is a big, huge one. There was somebody on a website going to ask for help. They were programming in Microsoft Windows. And they came in and they asked a question in the middle. Is there an API or a quick way to find out which window the mouse is in? So I've got my mouse on the screen. It's in this window. Can I figure out how to do this? And the person came back and answered it a lot like I might answer and said, well, I'm sorry, there's not an API for every possible thing. Sometimes you have to take 2 things and put them together. Here are some interesting things you might try. Get cursor position, so I get the XY coordinates, and then window from point. And that will tell you where the cursor is, right? They come back and they give an answer I get frequently, or a response I get a lot. Thank you for your reply. Start out real polite. Thanks for your reply, but, I hate that word, but, But window from point gives me the window of the object at the location of the cursor. Wait a minute, isn't that what you just asked for? Right? I'm looking for the top level window containing the cursor. Why didn't you say so? Why didn't you actually ask what you meant to ask? Because I just wasted my time answering what you asked. Now you're saying, but you gave me the wrong answer because my question was really this, right? And guaranteed, as soon as they give them the answer to this question, I know what the response would be. Thanks very much for your reply, but what I really, really, really meant, and you just keep going around in circles and back and forth. When I ask Tom, I get this a lot. I'm just going to flash up a couple of screens. I won't read them all, but I'll give you one of my favorite answers to these kind of vague questions. Somebody comes and says, I'm not able to extend my SGA max size to 2048 meg. I mean 2 gigabyte. Well, they actually said 2 gigabyte both times, but I set my DB cache size to this, shared pool size to that. Now I'm trying to extend my SGA max size, but I'm unable to extend it. Please tell me why it's happening and solution for it. The only answer I can give them is my car won't start. You have exactly as much information about why my car won't start as I have about your database not starting. When you can tell me why my car won't start, I'll tell you why your database won't. Because I didn't tell you any errors that I'm getting. I didn't tell you any lights on the dashboard that I might be seeing. I didn't tell you if it's making a noise or not making a noise. I'm not telling you what version of car I'm driving. And I'm not telling you what roads I'm driving it on. Think operating system or something like that. I looked at this and I could sort of guess. It looks like a 32-bit limit problem because it's that magic 2 gigabyte number. But there's no Oracle error messages here. There's no operating system. There's no symptoms. All they say is, I'm unable to do it. That could mean I don't know how to type, right? That's one possible reason. And it goes on from there. And I just get these all the time. I took a backup on a standby database, and I'd like to use this backup to create a test database on a different host. But I failed. That's it. I mean, that's the level of detail. My car won't start. Thank you very much for the wonderful site. Always start with, flattery. I wish to know how to export import tables successfully, which has XML type. I tried unsuccessfully. And that's the level of technical depth that they go into, right? No way to reproduce this, no way to know what they're hitting. I have a temporary table, blah, blah, blah. This was another, my car won't start. In the beginning of the procedure, it uses this table, I do this command, and it doesn't work. But this other command worked. If the one command worked, the other command would have worked. Because they're the same command, they just have two options on the end, and they actually happen to be the default options for that command. So I could guess. I'm looking, it's a truncate table. I bet you when they ran it the first time, they got something like an Aura 54, resource busy, meaning somebody else had inserted into that table, not yet committed. And when they tried it the second time, it worked because that other person wasn't logged in anymore. Right? But you have no way of knowing if that was the issue. For the simple reason that I have no error messages, I have no test case, I have no context. Right? And it just keeps on going. My car won't start. My car won't start. A relatively smart guy, name of Tim Hall, sitting here. I forgot this slide was in here. I would have taken it out had I known he was going to be here. But I used this as a good example because he writes lots of stuff, and he gets questions too. And he knows how frustrating this can be when the question's not specified in a semi-detailed fashion. And he wrote this great paragraph that I like. Unless you can clearly define a problem, there is no way you can communicate it to anyone else. That goes back to what I started with this morning. You got to be able to verbalize it and get it out, write it in the specification. What's more, unless you have an understanding of your problem, you can't judge the value of the answers, making you susceptible to suggested voodoo solutions. Meaning if you don't really understand what your problem is and somebody says, if you stand on your head and you chant this 5 times and then you hit enter, it will work, you might try it. And lo and behold, if it works, you're going to be standing on your head and doing that chant for the rest of your life, right? Even though it has nothing to do with the problem solution. Maybe the problem you were hitting was just something that didn't work then, but if I just waited 5 minutes, it would have worked all by itself. because 5 minutes ago somebody still had a transaction against the table, or a backup was taking place, or something was happening at that point. You want to get to the root cause of the problem so that you know how to fix it. So think it all the way through. Be very, very specific. Supply everything you think is relevant, but if something isn't relevant, hold it back. Like, I don't know how many times I get pages and pages of PL SQL code, and the error is this util-file.fopen isn't working. And I'm like, why didn't you just send me a snippet of code that's actually just 5 or 6 lines that just has the util-file.fopen not working? Get rid of everything else. Take that big code example and make it fit on the back of a napkin. When you start doing that, you will probably discover what you did wrong. Almost every time I do this myself, I take a big piece of code and I start removing pieces to try and isolate the error. I find out what I did wrong and I fix it myself. But if you make it really small, the odds that some other pair of eyes, somebody else looking at it, will be able to figure out what it is, increases dramatically. Phrase the problem as if you were explaining it to your mom. I use this one a lot. My mom has kept a tech support rep from Microsoft on the phone for over 40 hours. Okay? She is not very technically competent. If I can get her to understand the problem, anybody else should be able to understand the problem. So just sort of think of it in that term. Think long and hard about the edge cases. When somebody comes to me and asks me to write a query, and they say, you know, by department, I need to do this. And then I tell them, well, I need some example data to write the query. And they give me the data, but it only has one department in it. I'm like, if one of your requirements is by department, by all means, include more than one department. And make sure to include all the edge conditions, high and low values, boundary value conditions, and whatnot. Think long and hard about the implied constraints. You know, we want to limit to 140 characters for SMS. For the user interface designer, there were a whole bunch of things they forgot about data-wise. For the database guy, there were some character set issues that I didn't even think about with SMS because I didn't know a lot about SMS. So you might need a lot of people to look at this problem and actually figure it out. We write or generate way too much code. Just to show that I'm open to other databases, I'm using a SQL Server example here. But this is an actual stored procedure. That's not WTF like in a bad way. That stands for worse than failure. Okay? So it's safe. It's okay to do this in mixed company. But they had a stored procedure, started with a lot of variable declarations, and then as we went into it, we can see there was a query, and this query was basically taking an input in the where clause, and they were saying where that column equals that input, get me the maximum of this other one. And as I analyzed this, I figured out what they were doing. They were getting a foreign key out of one table to go against another table. So the next query they did was to get the first name and the last name out of this table, where a column equals the value we just selected out in the first query. Do you already see a way to optimize this perhaps? Right? If I'm taking the output of one query and I'm feeding it as input to the next query, how many queries do I need? 1. Now, I get the output from this query, and I'm going to run another query because I want to trim the nulls off. So I got the data out, and if it is null, I want to do something else to it. So I'll just run yet another query to do that. So now we're up to 3 queries. Then they realized, I don't need just the first name and the last name. I need the email address. I need the title. I need the company. I need the address. I need the city, the state, the zip, the country, the phone. And then to top it all off, I need the fax. I'm going to end the entire stored procedure with a query that just selects out the data that I've just selected out from everything else. And when questioned, the developer said, it's better this way, it's modular. Right? If you need another column, all I need to do is copy some code. I got it right there. If you don't need a column, I just delete it. It goes away. This is a good thing. This is a DBA's nightmare. Because if you run this stored procedure over and over again in your database, you're going to have a database full of billions of teeny tiny queries that do no work by themselves. Each one of these queries does maybe 3 IOs. 2 or 3 through an index and 1 more against the table. Right? And that's it. They're very, very fast. There's nothing to be tuned here except for the algorithm. this procedure should have had at most one SQL statement in it. And even then, I bet you that this SQL statement shouldn't even exist. This procedure shouldn't exist. This stored procedure is one of those get functions. You see functions that start with the word get underscore a lot. At least in English, I would see it. Maybe you call it something different. But it's like get employee information, get address, get this, get that. And that turns your database into a big VSAM file, right? Instead of somebody saying, oh, I need this employee information, but I need it joined with this other stuff. Well, if you're relying on the stored procedure to get it, you're not going to be able to join this stored procedure with something else. So what you end up doing is querying some table and calling this procedure 1,000,000 times, and then this procedure calls 20 separate queries to get all the stuff, and so now you got 20 million teeny tiny little queries in there. And you know what? If you run 20 million queries and each one takes 1/1000th of a second, I'll let you do the math on that, how many hours that is. We're close to a day of runtime at that point. Okay, so it's non-trivial. Look for ways to do things in a set-based fashion, to do things not necessarily more modular, but more intelligent. Don't tune the query, go back to the code and look for a better algorithm. Like with my count example this morning, the fastest way to run that count was not to run the count. We pretend everything will be all right. This is the next one. That is, we are in denial. Things happen, bad things happen. It's a matter of time before your database will crash and become unrecoverable due to hardware, software, active fire, flood, earthquake, volcano, whatever. Something bad will happen. GitHub, big open source sort of thing, pretty popular for doing source code control. Had to put this out once. Due to the configuration error, GitHub's production database was destroyed and then recreated. Not good. That's an understatement. What they had was a script for an automated test that somebody wrote and said, hey, this will be easy. Run the script and it resets the database. And that's great if you run it on your test system. If you accidentally ran it on the production machine, which looked just like test, guess what it did? It reset the database. Say things like worse, however, is that we may have lost some data between the last good database backup. I said, wait a minute, the last good database backup? Does that mean you have bad database backups someplace? Okay. And the time of the deletion. Newly created users and repositories are being restored, but pull request state changes and similar might be gone. We have lost data. Obviously, this should never have happened. It should be very difficult to cause a database failure like this. Yes, that is true, but we're humans, and human error is the #1 cause of data loss. Right? We're not as smart as we think we are. They could not recover their database entirely. Here's another one. This was a BitTorrent site, Demonoid. It used to be the largest one of its kind. It's not anymore. We'll be back as soon as possible, but this will probably be a prolonged downtime. Thanks for your patience. The site will return as soon as possible, but there was a problem that caused data loss, and the person who can help us get the data back is not able to help at this moment. The site will return when we can get his help. Okay? A loss of some months worth of data should be expected. There's some rumors about this site shutting down for good, and we're starting a new tracker next year. The rumors, of course, lies. There are no plans of shutting down or creating another site. Then they come back and months later still say, the site will return as soon as possible, but we're still waiting for that guy. He's going to come and he's going to help us at some point. Here's another. There used to be a phone called a Sidekick, and it was a user consumer device. And it was made to sync to the cloud, to this big fluffy thing, right? And so you turn on the phone and it syncs all your appointments, your calendars, and everything else like that. And it was sort of just replication. Let me sync with the database in the sky. Now, the people running this database decided to run it on RAID 5. Pretty good idea, pretty highly available. But they also made the bad decision to say that, hey, RAID 5 means we don't have to back up because RAID 5 is really good. Our data will be okay. Well, they came in and they did this thing called flashing the ROM. Okay, have you ever flashed your BIOS on your PC? The screen comes up and it says, do not unplug, do not turn off, do not look at me sideways, and make sure this blue bar gets all the way across, or else you have a big brick, right? They flashed, and they got halfway through, and it stopped. They had a bunch of bricks that used to be their sand, but they didn't work anymore. And they come out and say, regrettably, we think you lost everything, and don't turn your phone on, because if you turn on your phone, you know what your phone does? It syncs with our database. And if you synchronize with an empty database, guess what happens? You become empty, right? And so this is somewhat of a problem. And it took them days. They're coming back. T-Mobile had to stop selling the device because you couldn't even activate the phone anymore. And then you start getting news articles that look like this. You don't want a picture of a building with a train wreck coming out of the side of it, categorizing your company. That's a bad idea, right? So this whole backup and recovery stuff is something people sometimes don't think about honestly and really until it's too late, right? Once you've lost it, you've lost it. And companies go out of business because of this. And then the last section before I close is security matters. A lot of people don't build security into their applications. They add security later when people find holes in the application. Here's a common thing I hear. Oracle is very secure. Therefore, we don't need to be because you guys tell us you're secure, right? If you're secure, we're secure. Besides, it's not as important as having pretty looking screens. We're working with the business. They want functionality. They want it yesterday. Having to think about our schema design and privileges, just grant me DBA. It'll be okay. Nobody will take advantage of it, right? But it will make my job a lot easier. And if we add it later, I'm sure it's going to be non-intrusive, very performant, and easy to do. The analogy I use is, I'm a car manufacturer now. I didn't think about security, but I built the coolest car in the world. This car, you walk up to it, and it senses that you've walked up to it, and the little doors pop up, and it scans you, and it automatically adjusts the seat perfectly for your body size and everything else. And it says, please enter. And so you get in, and you're liking this car. You're going to buy it. And you notice there's no steering wheel, because you just tell this car where to go, and it takes you there. And so you say, I want this car. And you buy it, you drive it, you take it home. You come out the next morning, and it's gone. Why? Because your neighbor who's walking their dog walked past the car said, hey, buddy, come over here. Let me scan you. Where would you like to go? It was very user-friendly, right? They didn't think about security. So how would you secure this car now? The car manufacturer gets together, they think about it, and they issue car patch version 1.1. It's a big chain, okay, with a padlock. And their answer is you just throw this over the car, you pull it under, you chain it off, and the doors can't open anymore. It's patched. Well, what's your problem? I don't understand. This is a good fix for you. It's fairly intrusive. It's definitely not performant. If one of these big storms comes through, you're not going to want to have to do this to unlock your car and lock your car. And if somebody's chasing you at night, you'd really like to be able to use your remote clicker to have the locks come open and just sort of jump in the car and drive off. So it's not really a good solution. And don't laugh. It's happened, right? People will employ this. You can see this. It's a global sort of solution. But it's not the right way to do it. Security should have been designed into the car from day one. SQL injection, something I hope everybody in this room is familiar with. It's one of the number one ways that people, quote, hack into databases. They find a vulnerability in an application. And it happens over and over and over again. If your developers are building SQL statements based on user input, they're just concatenating data together, they're subject to SQL injection. And it's easy to find some websites that are. So, for example, here's a banking website. So it's a credit union. They actually take your money and store it and hopefully give it back to you later. Right? You want this. In their FAQ section, so in their frequently asked questions, they said the answers to your security questions are case sensitive and cannot contain special characters like an apostrophe or the words insert, delete, drop, update, null, or select. Do you think their website might be subject to SQL injection?
surprised they still have a website.
Surprised they still have a website, right? There should be no reason that I can't use the word drop as my security question, right? If the developers put it together correctly. You have to be thinking about this from day one. If you're gluing SQL statements together, you are subject to SQL injection. See, I had to start the day with mentioning bind variables. I have to finish the day with mentioning bind variables. If the developers would have used bind variables in their SQL statements, they could not be SQL injected. You cannot be SQL injected if you just use bind variables to pass inputs to the SQL statement. You can only be SQL injected when you take those inputs from the end user and concatenate them into your SQL statement. But how many developers are taught this over time? You know, they see the fastest way to get a statement to execute is to glue all the inputs together and call statement.execute, right? And it just works. It's easier than calling bind this, that, and the other thing, but it builds inherently insecure applications. SQL injection attacks happen every day, constantly, all over the place. And they're mostly done by 14-year-olds because you can just download kits these days, pump in the website name that you want to attack, and they'll automate the attack for you, trying every way they can to probe the website to see if it's vulnerable. So in conclusion, still keep always questioning things. What I said this morning. Do it in a non-annoying way, of course, but question things. Hey, for our disaster recovery, what happens if? You know, what if we are down for 5 days? What if we lost all of this data? Right? Because we only have it in one place, and the backups are kept on the rack right above the computer. Right? I can see the tapes are up there. That's great. But if the computer actually blew up, then it might actually melt the tapes themselves. You know, ask these questions. Look into these security issues. In those small changes, ask as many stupid questions as you can think of. They might lead to things that nobody else was thinking about. Okay? And on that, I'd like to close up for the day. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Hope you found it useful.